Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. We'll continue with the Dhamma talk called Turning Towards Emptiness, and this is chapter 17 in the book The Way It Is, which is included as part of this volume 3 of the Ajahn Sumedho anthology. So where we finished last time, a couple of days ago, I had just read, that sense of me and mine is just a habit of the mind. It's not the truth. If you really take the I am, and look at it objectively, the feeling created by that I am and I am this way, or I should be, should not be, is very different from when you're just reacting. In contemplating the Four Noble Truths, you have the truth of suffering, its arising, its cessation, and then the path. You can't know the path and the way out of suffering until you are aware of where everything ceases, in the mind itself. The mind is still vital and alert, even when there's no thought in it. But if you don't notice that, you believe you are always thinking. That's the way it seems. You only conceive of yourself when you're thinking, because you're identified with memory and the sense of I am or I am not. That yourself, quote unquote, is very much a conditioned, programmed perception in the mind. As long as you believe in that perception and never question it, you'll always believe that you are an obsessive thinker, and you shouldn't be this way, or you shouldn't feel that way, or you shouldn't worry, but you do. And you're a hopeless case. And so it goes on from one thing to another. So I am, quote unquote, is just a perception really. It arises in the mind and it ceases in the mind. When it ceases, note that cessation of thought. Make that cessation, that empty mind, a sign rather than just creating more things in the emptiness. You can get refined states of consciousness by fixing on refined objects, as in samatha meditation practices that emphasize calming the mind. But with the contemplation of the Noble Truths, you're using the wisdom faculty to note where everything ceases. And yet, when the mind is empty, the senses are still all right. It's not like being in a trance, totally oblivious to everything. Your mind is open, empty, or you might call it whole, complete, bright. Then you can take anything, like a fearful thought. You can take it, deliberately think it, and see it as just another condition of the mind, rather than a psychological problem. It arises, it ceases. There's nothing in it, nothing in any thought. It's just a movement in the mind, and therefore it's not a person. You make it personal by attaching to it, believing it. And I'm such a hopeless case. I know I can never be enlightened after all the things I've done, the stupid things, and I'm so selfish. And I've made so many mistakes. I know there's no hope for me. All that arises and ceases in the mind. This reflections of Luang Por on this, the place where everything ceases, and I think particularly where he says, you can't know the path and the way out of suffering until you are aware of where everything ceases. It's a very significant statement, and those of you who are familiar with the dialogue that the Buddha had with the Deva Rohitasa, which is very, very significant teaching, asking about where the world ends, and it's very very relevant in this respect. So the story goes that this Devata came to the Buddha and said, before I arose in this life as a deva, I was a human being, I was a yogi, and I had the ability to walk through the sky. He was a skywalker. So that Rohitasa Skywalker, not Luke Skywalker. So he said, but I made this vow that I would walk until I reached the end of the world. But even though I walked and I walked and made this determination, I never reached the end of the world, and I died along the way, and then was born in this Deva realm. And then the Buddha makes this very significant statement. He says, you can't reach the end of the world by walking, but unless you reach the end of the world, you won't reach the end of dukkha. You won't reach the end of suffering. And then he goes on to explain, it is in this very body, this fathom-long body, sort of 6-foot-long body, with its perceptions and its thoughts, there is the world, the origin of the world, the cessation of the world, and the way leading to the cessation of the world. So in that respect, he's equating the world, loka, with dukkha, with unsatisfactoriness. And in that respect, he's meaning the world, loka, as as something that is being seen as solid, as real, as substantial, as having an absolute quality to it. And so that the comment that Bhikkhu Bodhi made about that particular statement, he said this is probably the most profound statement made in the history of human philosophy, which is, I think, he's not someone who's prone to sort of exaggerating or overstating things. He also has a PhD in philosophy before he became a bhikkhu. So I think Columbia University in America. So he knows the field very well. So that's a very emphatic statement, and just as Luang Por Sumedho puts it here, that you can't know the path and the way out of suffering until you're aware of where everything ceases, and so that the place where the world ends, in case you're wondering, is how I understand that, how I read that, is it's in this very, as the Buddha says, it's in this very life of ours, in this very fathom-long body with its perceptions and its thoughts. There's the world, the origin, the cessation of the world, and the way leading to the cessation of the world. And it's really in this very awareness, this is where the world ends. The substantiality of the world. And again, as Luang Por Sumedho says, that it's not as though you don't perceive things. The mind is empty, the senses are still all right, we're still seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, but when there is that clear awareness, that open quality of awareness, then that the field of perception, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, thinking, remembering, imagining, that's not given any solidity. It's recognized as sunya, as empty, as void of substance. And in another dialogue that the Buddha had with Mogaraja, a young Brahmin student, he says, if you can see the world as empty, if you see that that's the nature of the world as empty, Mogaraja, then the king of death will not be able to find you. That's how you evade the king of death. That's how death is transcended, is by seeing the world as empty. And so that then, in terms of our own practice, this is sustaining that quality of awareness, of knowing here is seeing, this is hearing, this is feeling, this is remembering, this is imagining, this is an emotion, this is a plan, this is a mood, this is a sensation, that's what this is. And knowing that these can't be anything more than mental events. They're sensory impressions that arise, take shape, and dissolve. And even when they take shape, there's no solid thing absolutely there. It's a mental event. It's a sankhara. It's a formed, a conditioned set of perceptions. And so that I would say that this is where everything ceases, as Luang Por puts it, where everything ceases in the mind itself. And that, so when we talk about, on a worldly level, talking about the end of the world, it can sound like a bit apocalyptic, that you're looking forward to the planet being swallowed up by the sun, or the heat death of the universe at the end of the eon, or whatever it might, your particular model of cosmological development or cycles or whatever, but this is talking about the end of the world on a psychological level. And in a related passage that I quote very often, that's connected to this teaching to Rohitassa, when the Buddha defines what he means by loka, he means by the world, and he says that whereby one is a perceiver of the world and a conceiver of the world, that is what is called the world in this Dhamma and discipline. So that very means, or that way that the mind is a perceiver of loka, a loka sanyi, or a conceiver of the world, lokamani, that is what we call the world. So the way in which the world is formed, that's what the Buddha calls the world. So effectively he's saying the only meaningful world that we can talk about is the world of our own experience. This seeing, this feeling, this remembering, this thinking, this opinionating, this imagining, that's the only world we can meaningfully talk about. You can't meaningfully speak about the world outside of the agency of our own experience, if that makes sense. So, and a number of Western philosophers made the same kind of observation, is that you have to take into account that the world that we're speaking about is known through this human life, this human mind. It's known at this human scale, and through this language, this conditioning of language and thought that we have. So I feel that teaching of the Buddha, dialogue with Rohitassa, and then particularly understanding what we mean by the world, and the ending of the world is not a disaster. It's not like annihilation. It's a liberation. It's seeing that the world, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, the mind's formulation of its ideas about the world, its ideas about I and me and mine, the subject world and the object world, these are necessarily empty. They're conditioned. They're not who and what we are. They're not substantial. They're not real. And so that in that respect, the ending of dukkha is an exact parallel of the ending of the world. It's a letting go of the mind's grasping and the way that the mind makes the world something solid and permanent. So it's in a way enabling the heart to awaken to its limitless, timeless, intrinsic nature. The heart awakens to Dhamma, which is its basic nature, which is timeless, formless, boundless, limitless. It's not bound by time or space or individuality. So when we develop that, and in one of the readings last week, I was saying how when we use this, particularly using the practice to get perspective on thinking, and so that the thoughts of I am, or just simple practical thoughts like today is Sunday, or this month is March, or we are living in England, this developing a sense of clarity with the arising and passing of thought. That's a very, very powerful, skillful means for not getting drawn into the content of thought, but just being able to recognize, this is the thinking mind. It's functioning in this way. That it's having this particular pattern of creations of ideas or concepts, and then in that way, there's two effects that come from that that are extremely beneficial. One is you recognize that just because you think it doesn't mean it's true, rather than assuming that every thought that goes through our head is some kind of accurate representation of reality. It's like, no, it's just a thought. It's like if I have the thought, today is Saturday. Where are we? Yeah, not even in the far west, sort of halfway across the Pacific Ocean. I think it's not Saturday there. So it's like it's an incorrect thought. You can think the thought today is Saturday. It's not accurate. It's just a thought. And even if you think today is Sunday, you can recognize also, that's just a thought. It's just a way of labeling this particular feature of the calendar in this particular country, using this particular language. That's all. This isn't intrinsically Sunday. You can have an agreement to change the calendar, or you'll move to a different country and they have a different name, like go across the channel and this is dimanche. It's not Sunday, it's a different language in France. So in Germany it's Sonntag, I think. Is that right? Yeah, Sonntag. Thank you. Just checking. So, is it Sunday? Is it dimanche? Is it Sonntag? What day is it today? So, the mind is able to not get drawn into the contents of thought. So that's the first thing, you recognize that just because you think it doesn't mean it's true. And secondly, it makes the insight into not self far more apparent, that there's the recognition of, there's a thought, but just like if we feel the wind on our skin, we don't think that's my air, that's my wind, or we see the color of a daffodil, that's my yellow. It's like, no, there's a perception of a yellow color in the flower of the daffodil. There's a feeling of the wind on the skin, but it's felt here, but it doesn't have an owner. It's not a sense of anything that belongs. So the more that thought, concept, memory, and that kind of sort of verbal thinking, the vaci sankhara, the verbal formation in thought is seen just as a shape in nature, then there's a diminishing of identification. I think, I remember, I'm planning, this is my idea, my mind. And so that loosening of that sense of ownership around that. Also, maybe when speaking about emptiness and the empty nature of things, I think this other comment that Luang Por makes here, your mind is open, empty, or you might call it whole, complete, bright. That's similar to the way that Luang Por Chah would talk about emptiness as well. That he said, we call it empty, but actually it's full of wisdom. So just like we can say the space in this temple is empty. There's a number of us people sitting in here, but the temple is mostly empty space. Well, it's not. It's filled with nitrogen and oxygen and carbon dioxide. It's filled with light. You got 60 billion neutrinos passing through every square centimeter of space. Every second, I think it is. You can't see them or hear them. The planet is being drenched by billions of neutrinos every second. And so, is it empty? Yeah, it's empty in terms of, the hall is not filled with people, but it's full in many, many other respects. So terms like empty or emptiness, they're relative terms. They're speaking about being empty of particular qualities. And so that when we talk about the empty mind, actually in the scriptures, very, very often when there's a definition of what is meant by empty, by sunya, or emptiness, sunyata, then it's defined as being empty of self and what belongs to a self. That's one of the common ways that empty quality is defined, so that's specifically like a specific way of regarding that quality of emptiness and the empty nature of things. It doesn't mean that there's no pattern there. It doesn't mean that it's an absolute quality, but it's saying it's empty of self, empty of that which belongs to a self. And so that's saying it's empty of self, but it's full of wisdom. It's full of the light of understanding. So any questions, thoughts, reflections? Evgenia, there's a microphone just beside Anagarika Market there. Yeah.
Maybe to ask about sometimes how we name things can change our perception of what is, and especially with some mental events like some teachers said that if you don't really name your emotions like anger or fear and observe how they are, how they arise and process, because if you call it anger or fear, you call all your memories about it or your perception, and you don't really conceive them as they are. And by this, you're already changing, like distorting your perception. So maybe to ask a little bit to talk about this, what is really not helpful sometimes to put into words your own mental events and how to approach them without naming and calling.
Yes, very good question. Well, it's like a knife. You know, you can use a knife to peel an apple, and to cut up an apple into sections so it's easy to eat, or you can use a knife to the wrong way around, and you end up cutting your own fingers, and you don't cut the apple, and blood all over the place, and you've hurt yourself. So, like many things, it's that kind of reflection. So, naming something, this is anger, or this is worry, or this is lust, or this is regret. If it's used in a skillful way, and the attitude is not tied up with conceit and self-view, then the naming of what's there can be very effective in helping to let go of it, for the mind to not identify, rather than by making sure that the mind says, okay, it's not I'm angry, but in this moment there's the feeling of anger, and it feels this way. So that the mind is picking up that experience with a lot of mindfulness and wisdom. It's picking it up in a skillful way. If it picks it up in terms of I'm really angry, and I've got an anger problem, I've got to get rid of this anger, and that's the either the way that we're approaching it, or the consciously or unconsciously. Oh, I've got a terrible anger problem. What can I do to get rid of it? Oh, yeah, this is anger, meaning this is anger. I've got an anger problem and I need to get rid of it. So that's picking it up with picking up the knife in the wrong way. So you cut your fingers, and so that it all depends on the attitude and the skillfulness with which we use those things. It does make a big difference how things are named. So, like for example. If we say, I've got a real anger problem, or I've got an anxiety problem, or I've got a jealousy problem, or a lust problem, I always feel self-critical. Just the way that we name things and form those thoughts, and we sort of calling it a problem. And again, I found Luang Por Sumedho's advice on this area, really, really helpful, because in some respects you can hear the teachings and you think, yeah, I've got a real fear problem. Yeah, I need to work on my fear problem because it's something that has a big impact, and yeah, that needs some attention. But by saying I've got a fear problem, right there, you sort of picked up the knife by the sharp edge, and the very way that you're framing it in your thoughts, in your approach. And so back in this same kind of period, the late 80s, Luang Por Sumedho would emphasize over and over again, don't think in terms of me and my problem, but in this moment, this is the arisen state, that here is the awake mind aware of worry, or aware of fear, rather than I've got to work on my fear problem. Here is the experience of fear. It feels this way. Here's the aware mind, the awake mind, the Buddha mind, seeing the way things are, rather than framing it in terms of me and my problem. So what really helps then is a lot of mindfulness around how we name things and hold things. Say that the way we talk about ourselves, or just internally, or where we're speaking about it to other people, your friends, you say, "Oh yeah, I'm such a worrier. I'm always getting excited and obsessed by things," and to really hear the way we speak, either out loud or to other people, and say, "Well, wait, I just said to my friend, I just said to her, I'm really obsessive." So let's rewind. Well, why did I say that? Or is that really true? Or is that the case all the time? When I say, "Yeah, I'm always obsessing about things," it's like, well, more accurately, we can say, from time to time, the mind gets hold of things and gets stuck on them. It obsesses on things, and then the result of that is usually dukkha. Okay. But rather than I'm always obsessing about things. And so that a lot of mindfulness around the way that we talk about our practice. So we talk about our mind, our conditioning, our character, and so on. And my experience is it makes a huge difference. And when Luang Por was giving these kind of teachings back then, yeah, I'd see over and over again how the mind would just get, the habit would be, I've got a fear problem. I'm always worrying, and then to take Luang Por's advice and say, well, I tell myself I'm always worrying, but that's not true. Worry tends to arise, but there's times when there isn't any worry. It arises and it ceases. So to say I'm always worrying, it's not true. And then also the I am gets formed, it gets spoken and believed in without a second thought. And so again, to rewind from that, to step back and say, well, there is the experience of worrying. There is the mind is aware of this worried feeling, woof, coming into being. Here is the awareness of that worried feeling. It doesn't have to be turned into me and my problem. I've got a worry problem. I'm an anxious person. It doesn't have to be created. So, it really does make a difference. I find it's a lot of work because our habits of thinking and speaking are really, really strong for most people. So, bringing attention to that and then having the resolution is like samma sankappa, the kind of intention. Okay, don't just follow that. Be clear about that, and then steer it in a different direction. Rephrase the way that we talk about our experience, our habits, and then looking at the results of that. So I found that when I did that, and he made the effort to question those judgments and the ways of thinking and speaking, then it made a very, very big difference. It took a lot of work, but the results were very powerful. And the more that the mind could see, well, no, here is the experience of worry. There's a worried feeling arising and passing away. It's like, oh, look at that. So it was very illuminating, very, very liberating. And you find there's a lot more flexibility, a lot more space in your heart, in your mind, in the world than you thought there was. Yeah. When the mind is locked into habit, ignorant habits, then there's no space, there's no way forward, there's no flexibility. Things that feel like they're really fixed. I'm really stuck with being this way forever. But if this kind of mindfulness of thought and habitual thought patterns, if that's really developed, then you find there's a lot more space in the world. Life has a lot more possibilities. You don't have to be stuck in a particular rut. There's a lot more space, a lot more opportunity. There's many. We're not a prisoner of our own habits, our own thinking, our own say conditioning, and and that's very important. Well, just very, very simply, I remember years ago when Luang Por Liam was visiting Abhayagiri Monastery. Luang Por Liam, the abbot of Wat Pah Pong. So he was visiting Abhayagiri Monastery, and one afternoon we had a questions and answer session with him. And somebody asked him, Luang Por, what would you say was the biggest problem? What was the biggest obstacle that you had in your early life as a monk, in your early years as a bhikkhu? What was your biggest problem? And he started to answer, and he said, well, there was a lot of, in the early days, there was a lot of fear. And then he sort of, kind of halfway through the sentence, he stopped himself and he said, calling it a problem, an obstacle, an upasak in Thai, he says, that's not really it's not a very helpful way of thinking of it, because he said, out of habit or custom, we talk in that way, saying this obstacle, this upasak, this problem, this panha. But he said, really, those are the exact things that help us to develop our strengths. And he said, I forget exactly how he talked about it, but I think he used an example of playing a sport. That said, if you're playing football and you're only playing against the next village, then you don't have to try very, very hard. It's not a very challenging game. But if you're in the provincial championships and you're playing against the best team, you've got to raise your game. And so that was the expression he used. It's called raising your game. You've got to really pay close attention and try really hard, because the competition is more challenging. So you learn more important lessons by being challenged by the better team. And again, I can't guarantee that was the exact example that he used, but that was the point of saying that these things that we call difficulties or obstacles or problems, that's a negative way of speaking about them. But he'll say, if you just look at things from a different angle, then these are the very ways that we bring out the best in ourselves. We learn the most important lessons because of fear or laziness or self-criticism and such like. They're painful experiences often, but the lessons that are learned from them are very real and liberating. So so even though you can label something like anger or greed, or selfishness, jealousy, laziness, and they're on the list of the sort of akusala, the unwholesome column. But it's important to not label them in terms of being something that is absolutely bad or wrong or that need to be wiped out, but that if the attitude is skillful, if they're looked at and approached from a different angle, then the lessons that we learn are often more powerful than when things are comfortable and easy and just built up around the wholesome. I think we printed out that, because also Luang Por Liam is quite a builder, and so I think we called that, we printed out that talk in a little booklet, and we called it The Right Angle, because you use, for building, you use a right angle to measure squares. So we thought it was a neat title for a Luang Por Liam Dhamma talk, The Right Angle. I don't know if we've got copies in the library, but it was a long time ago now, but that's where I remember that from. Okay, so to continue. Believing is grasping, isn't it? I know what I am, and I know I'm no good. You believe that, and that's what grasping is. You create that belief, so the mind goes on in that way. And you can find all kinds of proof that you're no good. You can even start getting paranoid. Everyone knows that I'm no good too. Yesterday, Venerable Sujito walked by, and I just knew that he knows I'm no good. Then this morning I came into the hall, and Sister Rochner looked at me a little bit strangely. She knows. Through belief, you can see and interpret everything that people do in a personal way. It's as if they've all been condemning and judging you. That's paranoia. Even the most beautiful thoughts and aspirations, as well as the most evil and nasty ones, arise and cease in the mind. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying good and evil thoughts are the same. They have the same characteristic of arising and ceasing, that's all. In other respects, they're different. Good thoughts are good thoughts. Evil thoughts are evil thoughts. So I'm not saying that it's all right to think evil thoughts, but I'm pointing beyond the quality of the thought. Love and hate arise and cease in the mind. In this perspective, you're going to the reflective mind, where most people are totally unaware. People are generally only aware of themselves as a personality, an emotion or a thought. In other words, as a condition. For practice, don't worry about the qualities that go through the mind, how wonderful, interesting, beautiful, ugly, nasty or neutral they might be. We're not investigating qualities or denying the quality of any thought, but just noting the way it is. Then you leave it alone so that it ceases. You create a thought, deliberately put it into the mind and let it go. To let go doesn't mean that you push it away. You leave the thought alone, though you're aware of it during the whole time. The moment before the thought, the interstices, and the ending. So that, in this passage, it's also important to in a way to be aware that we're talking about the two levels of truth, as it were. So, as he's saying that you might have a wholesome thought and unwholesome thought, and they both arise and cease. Their fundamental nature is anicca, dukkha, anatta, and they're both exactly the same in that respect. But on the mundane level, on the human level, there's the wholesome and the unwholesome, the good and the evil. There's the constructive and beneficial, and there's the destructive and harmful. And so it's important not to confuse those two levels of truth. But what he's pointing to here is that love and hate arise and cease in the mind. And Luang Por Chah would often point to this, particularly because he'd say a lot of people want to do away with the harmful and cultivate the good, but that which is beyond the good and the evil, then people don't know about that. People don't understand that. So Luang Por Chah would often address this area and talk about what's beyond good and evil. And so sometimes that can be misunderstood, or say, oh, therefore we shouldn't be concerned about what's wholesome or unwholesome, or what's in accordance with conventions of goodness or badness. That's only for the poor swine who aren't as wise as I am. It's a completely wrong view and not the Buddha's way at all. When the Buddha made a synopsis, a brief summary of his teaching, is to sabba papasa akaranang, the not doing of all evil, kusalasu upasampada, the doing of what is wholesome, sacitta pariyodapanang, the purification of the heart, etang buddhana sasananti. This is the teaching of all the Buddhas. So when he summarized his teaching, it's like the not doing of what is unwholesome, the doing of what is wholesome, and the purification of the heart. That's the practice. So that it's very important not to confuse the sort of ultimate level and the conventional level. But also in the monastery, we have the precepts. And our commitment to living by the precepts is that standard that we have that creates a very powerful, strong container. I often think of it like in a chemistry lab. Those of you who remember your science classes or worked in laboratories, when you have a number of very like strong acids or alkalis or chemicals that are very corrosive or dangerous, explosive, then you put them in a bowl, a porcelain bowl with a good glaze on it, so that it's a strong container, so you can have strong acids or explosive things or poisonous things, and they won't cause any harm. They're contained in that bowl. That crucible is called a safe container. So the precepts that we have, whether it's the 8 precepts, 10 precepts, 227 precepts, that we keep in a monastery. This is a powerful and sturdy, strong container. It's like a wonderful crucible there that we can look at love and hate and fear and desire and regret and hope and so on and so forth, because they're contained in this safe, sort of almost indestructible container, in this crucible, in this vessel. And so that understanding how the wholesome and the unwholesome work, then we know we're not going to. You might have a murderous thought. You might think, I want to kill that anagarika, but you've taken the first precept, panatipata viramani. So you're not going to kill that person, but you can watch that murderous feeling arising and passing away. And so that the commitment to the precepts and the community standards are really important in helping us to say get to know those mental states and to understand their nature, and to really say support the seeing of the transient, unsatisfactory, and non-personal, the non-self aspect of every mind state. Whether you've fallen in love with someone, or you want to murder them, or you're jealous of them, or you want to apologize to them for something, then you can watch those states of mind: attraction, aversion, fear, desire, jealousy, admiration. We can watch all those, study them, and get to know them, and understand them, and then also see that jealousy arises and passes away. Being in love arises and passes away. Wanting to murder someone arises and passes away. These are intrinsically transient, empty, and ownerless states that are not self, and none of them can permanently satisfy or liberate. So that it's one of the reasons why the what we form the community around is not just aspiration to nibbana or the love of the Dhamma. The community, what we do, the way that we gather and we sort of refresh our commitment to community life is by reciting the precepts. So on the moon days, the full moon and the new moon, for the monastic community, then and on the lay community can refresh their precepts too. We recite the monastic rule. We kind of reiterate that. We sort of remember, because that sense of keeping the crucible strong and reliable, that's what enables us to live together and to work together. So just having an aspiration to enlightenment, or the love of the Dhamma, or revering the triple gem, that's one side. In a way, that's that works on one side of our nature. But that isn't enough to hold a community together. Also, what holds us together is the precepts, and enables us to function as a human group. I was at a conference in San Francisco a few years ago on mindfulness and Buddhist meditation, and one of the speakers at this conference was a researcher and a neuroscientist called Clifford Saran, I think, who worked at University of California in Davis. And he had a really interesting study that he'd done about behavior, and so one of the things that he pointed out is it's literally a different part of the brain. That the part of the brain that says I love goodness and the truth is one part of the brain, and I shouldn't kill people and I shouldn't steal things is run by a different part of the brain, and the conditioning around the limiting of unskillful actions is stronger and more effective than the conditioning around wholesome and say noble aspirations. It's literally hardwired into our brains. And so, because sometimes people say, well, why does the Buddha have the precepts in terms of refraining from killing, refraining from stealing, refraining from sexual misconduct, refraining from lying and intoxicants? Why doesn't he say, I love mindfulness, Or I want to practice unselfishness and generosity. Yeah, I want to preserve all life. And I know some people have rewritten the precepts in this very sort of positive language. So it was a real kind of eye-opener. And I don't think that Dr. Saran had much of a background in Buddhism. I think it was really what the neuroscience was telling him was that if you set things up in terms of limiting the unskillful, don't do this, don't do that, then it has a much more powerful practical effect than you say, yeah, I love the good and generosity, but that won't necessarily stop you helping yourself to your friend's supply of chocolate in the fridge. Whereas if you're taking the precept, I will refrain from stealing or refrain from taking what is not given, that'll, when you get to the fridge, you'll say, well, that's actually not mine. And again, it was a few years ago that I came across that, or was introduced to that. But it really did strike me as how it's another example of where the Buddha's practicality in realizing what actually works on the ground, what works in terms of a human group working together for mutual benefit. Because sometimes people say, well, why we meet every fortnight for a Sangha meeting, everyone's got to be there, and why don't we say, I'm determined to use my life for the purpose of enlightenment? Why do we say, kind of go through all our precepts one by one, and down to, for the nuns and the monks, down to the tiny details of etiquette and such like. And so I feel that it's because the Buddha saw that's what helps us to live together. That's what helps us to work together. Even though it might not seem terribly inspiring, having an agreed standard of behavior and a conscious commitment to say, not follow our aggressive or dishonest or greedy impulses, that is what's most effective. That works best on the ground for us to live together as a human group. So it's a bit of a digression into the neuroscientific realm, but I do feel it's a significant observation. And also it says, that's why we talk in terms of refraining from doing this, refraining from this and refraining from that, rather than just affirming, say, one's love of life and the love of truth and generosity and so on, that on its own doesn't help us to behave and work more as respectfully and as harmoniously as the conscious, say, limiting of our selfish or destructive behavior through the precepts as they are worded in terms of refraining. So to continue. We don't notice the space around thought very much. It's just like the space in this room. I have to call your attention to it. What does it take to be aware of the space in this room? You have to be alert. With the objects in the room, you don't have to be alert. You can just be attracted or repelled. I don't like that. I like this. You can just react to the quality of beauty and ugliness, whether it pleases or displeases you. That's our habit. Our life tends to be reaction to pleasure and pain, beauty and ugliness. We see beauty and we say, "Oh, look at that. Isn't it absolutely fantastic?" Or we think, "Oh, it's disgusting." But the beautiful objects and the ugly ones are all in space. And to notice space, you withdraw your attention from the beautiful and the ugly objects. Of course, they're still there. You don't need to throw them out. You don't have to tear down the building so that we can have space here. But if you don't concentrate on what's in that room with love or hate, if you don't make anything out of it, your attention withdraws from the objects and you notice the space. So we have a perspective on space in a room. We have perspective on space in a room like this. You can reflect on that. Anyone can come and go in this space. The most beautiful, the most ugly, saint and sinner. They can all come and go in this space, and the space is never harmed, ruined or destroyed by the objects that come and go in it. The mind works on the same principle, but if you're not used to seeing the spaciousness of your mind, you're not aware of the space that the mind really is. So you're unaware of the emptiness of the mind because you're always attached to an idea or an opinion or a mood. With insight meditation, you're reflecting on the 5 khandhas, on the body, rupa, feelings, vedana, perception, sanya, mental formations, sankhara, and sense consciousness, vijnana. We may want to get rid of them, but that's another condition, another sankhara that we create. So we investigate them until they no longer delude us and allow them to cease in the empty mind. When you think, my body's still here, how does it cease? It's still here, isn't it? Consider that the body will live its lifespan. It's been born, and it'll disappear when its karmic force ends. What happened to Napoleon? What happened to the Queen of Sheba? To Confucius and Lao Tzu and Marie Antoinette? Beethoven and Bach? They're memories in our minds. They're just perceptions in people's minds now. But that's all they ever were anyway, even when their bodies were alive. Venerable Sumedho is a perception in the mind. In my mind, it's a perception. In your mind, it's a perception. Right now, the perception of it is, Venerable Sumedho is alive and kicking. When the body dies, the perception changes to, Venerable Sumedho is dead. That's all. The perception of death is there along with the name Sumedho, where now it is alive and kicking. So as you experience it, the body is a perception that arises and ceases in the empty mind. With this realization of the empty mind, you can develop the Eightfold Path very skillfully. The Eightfold Path is based on right understanding, and that is the understanding of cessation. So this is another of the practices that Luang Por has talked about a lot over the years, noticing space, and it's a fairly simple exercise. Just realizing when you come into the temple, you might notice the Buddha Rupa, you might notice the other people, and just to shift your attention. You might notice the microphone or the camera, but just noticing that the camera is interesting, but the space 1 foot to the right of the camera is not interesting. To see how, in a way, how there's a lot more space in the world than we realize, because the attention keeps going on to the thing that we're aiming at, the door we're going towards, or the person that we want to talk to, or the person that we don't want to talk to. We focus on the objects, and our senses, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, thinking, they're heavily conditioned to be noticing the objects. Our biological ancestry, our conditioning around the instincts is all around objects, things that are dangerous, that are going to hurt us or going to eat us, or things that we can eat. Our territory, this is my patch, that's not your patch, you're entering my patch, go away. The attention is drawn to the sense world. It doesn't notice space. An important aspect of the practice then is just getting to know and to respect that kind of conditioning, how strong these forces are. Like, say, if it's the mealtime and you come up to the servery and you're hungry, how much attention goes to the space between the food dishes? If you're anything like me, not much. It's just you're hungry, and so the eye goes to the dish. It doesn't go to, oh look, there's a space between the spoon and the dish. That's not what attracts the attention, because it's time to collect food, and that's the conditioning that we have. So also, it's not about spacing out in a foolish way, or not being mindful or wise in the way that we apply this kind of reflection. But noticing space. Now, say if I hold up my hand like this, then I say, what do you see? Then you might say, well, it's your hand, or there's 4 fingers and a thumb, or it's your left hand. Not many of us would say there's space between your fingers and your thumb, Ajahn, because that's not so significant. The attention doesn't go to that. So it's a kind of loosening or just an expanding of one's appreciation, and then also seeing the effect of that, as Luang Por Sumedho is saying here, that we might make these judgments, or that's disgusting, or that's ugly, or that's mine, that's not mine, that's yours, and to notice the space and to see the effect. Oh, like the mind isn't judging that as beautiful or ugly or mine or not mine. It's just that. It's just space. Aha. So it helps the judgments that the mind makes to be put into a clearer perspective. And seeing how when we develop this as an exercise, the effect of that is that the mind gets less reactive and compulsive around what is labeled as mine or yours, or good or bad, beautiful or ugly, appropriate, inappropriate. There is an inner spaciousness that is, say, encouraged or is developed on account of noticing the external spaciousness. So then maybe the last thing to say here once again about cessation. So all things, we investigate things until they no longer delude us and allow them to cease in the empty mind. When you think, my body's still here, how does it cease? It's still here, isn't it? Again, as I was saying the other day, how Luang Por Sumedho in the middle of a Dhamma talk said, I'm going to stop existing. That he didn't evaporate or go invisible, but you could still see his body, but the way his mind was holding that experience was no longer existing, no longer standing out. So it's the thingness is what ceases. And again, say relating to that teaching with Rohitasa, the end of the world, the cessation of the world, the ending of the world, it ceases in that quality of awareness, so that yes, there's the perception of a body here, but there's the physical sensation, there's Vedana, there's sound, there's color, there's the different aspects of sensation, but those are all mental events. There's touch consciousness, hearing consciousness, eye consciousness, thinking consciousness. They all come together and say, I am perceiving my body. But the thought, I am perceiving my body, is also just another mental event. These are all arising and passing away, so that the solidity, the thingness, the kind of crunchy, if you like, the substantiality of the world of things, that's what ceases, even as the perceptions still continue. They carry on according to the laws of nature and cause and effect, but what it's saying is that there's a recognition that there cannot be any absolute presence there, any substance that is absolutely, permanently and completely there. So any final questions, comments? Okay, we can leave.
Sorry, Ajahn. Talking about not identifying with thoughts, often we talk about it in terms of negative perceptions, that type of thing. Is there any value in, especially along the path, is there any value in identifying with some of the more wholesome, positive thoughts as a way to kind of help overcome the balance? Often I feel like it's more negative and less positive, or more unwholesome than wholesome.
Do you mean developing objectivity around, say, self-affirmation, or?
Perhaps perhaps if I was developing more loving kindness towards myself, that I could say, I have more metta, it's kind of identification with that along the way. Is that a helpful thing, or is it best to always try and stay more less identified?
Well, it's if I'm understanding what you're asking, it's like, again, it's a bit to do with the two levels of truth. So we have these, the verses on the Brahma Viharas: "May I abide in well-being. May I be happy. May all beings be happy. May all beings not be parted from the good fortune they have attained." So very much so working on the level of mundane reality, or I'm of the nature to age, I've not gone beyond aging, I'm of the nature to sicken. In terms of anatta, that's not true. You know, on the ultimate level, it's like, no, that which is aging is not self. You know, that the body is not self. So that those kind of reflections are very much a part of the practice. That sort of establishing skillful self-view, as it were, as opposed to unskillful self-view. But then the next layer is then letting go of the self-view. So may I abide in well-being, may all beings be freed from all suffering. That those are all about cultivating wholesome qualities within the sort of the form of a conventional self, this body, this mind, this life. May it be inclined more towards loving kindness and compassion than towards selfishness and cruelty. And so those affirmations, a lot of those, the nusatis, contemplation of death, contemplation of loving kindness, they're about the conscious, say, development of the wholesome and letting go of the unwholesome. But then that's sort of stage one, and then stage two is then letting go of that. So for sometimes it's confusing if people have say focused on insight meditation and done a lot of practice on not self, and then they join in the chanting and say, may I abide in well-being, you know, may all beings be freed from all suffering. It's like, well, who are these beings? We spent half the day letting go of all the beings and not creating them, and now we've got to create them and wish them well. So what am I supposed to do, Ajahn? And so it's like, you know, many aspects of things that we function on sort of different levels. And I think as human beings we're quite capable of doing that. But we recognize, okay, on one level, this is, you can say, today is Sunday, so there is a Dhamma reading at 6 o'clock. On an ultimate level, there is no 6 o'clock, there is no Sunday. These are just conventions. There's no substance there. But on the level of human agreements and being conveniently in the same place for a particular purpose, then we say, it's Sunday, there's a Dhamma reading, it begins at 6 o'clock. You know, if you want to be there, be there. So even you're using the conventions for a particular purpose, but then you're also recognizing, well, there isn't. You know, Sunday is just a human agreement. A living being is just an agreement, really. You know, that there isn't anything more than what we agree to call it and make it. And so it's and again, going back to that statement of the Buddha, Sabba papasa akaranang kusala supasampada, the not doing of all evil, the doing of what is wholly good, the purification of the heart. It's like you start off with the mundane, like stop harming other people, other beings, and yourself. Okay, cultivate the wholesome, cultivate the good, and then you know, having let go of the wholesome, having cultivated the good, then you let go of clinging to those qualities, and the heart is then able to see things from a more comprehensive and profound perspective. That make sense? Very good. Okay, I'll leave it there for today.